Hello, welcome to PC Jack. What exactly should you be looking for when you're trying to buy a motherboard? Let's find out. So, trying to choose a motherboard can often be a fairly daunting task with such a wide variety to choose from. There's often a multitude of things that you need to consider in terms of what you actually need from your motherboard. But today, I've broken down a few of the key things that you should be considering when you're trying to decide on what motherboard you should buy. So the first thing that you should always consider when buying a motherboard is what platform are you going to use? By this, I mean, are you going to use an AMD CPU or an Intel CPU? There's pros and cons to using both platforms, but once you know what CPU you are going to use, then this will help make the decision a lot easier for you. For today, I have an Asus ROG Strix B550i motherboard. This is a motherboard with an AM4 socket for AMD CPUs. I'll use it to point out some of the things that you need to look at, but the majority of things are going to be the same across the board for both Intel and AMD. The only difference being is the actual socket itself, amongst other features. So once you know what CPU you're using, this will help narrow down the search for you. The next thing that you should consider once you know what CPU you're using is what chipset you want for your motherboard. There's a multitude of chipsets to choose from. On AMD's side, there's B550 or X570, going back as far as B450, X470 for example. Whereas on the Intel side, you've got the current chipsets Z590 and B560, as well as other platforms such as H510 or even the previous generation with Z490 and B460. Each chipset will offer different benefits. When it comes to Intel, their Z590 range will be the only motherboards on that platform to support overclocking. If you were to go for B560 or H510, those are more budget entry-level options which do not offer overclocking. So if you chose a non-K-SKU Intel CPU, those might be quite a good option for you. But if you bought a K-SKU and you are looking to overclock, you would have to go for a Z590. Whereas on the AMD side, all their CPUs are unlocked and able to be overclocked on multiple chipsets, with the exception of A320 and A520. So while you can overclock on B550, it's not going to overclock as well as X570. But with AMD CPUs, they turbo fairly well on their own, so the actual need for overclocking isn't too essential. So your best bet is to look at what features each chipset offers and decide what suits you best. Those features of which I will be going through later on in the video. So, the next thing that I like to consider when choosing a motherboard is going to be its actual size. Now, determining the size of your motherboard is also going to determine the size of your case. So, there's a couple of options you can choose from. There's standard ATX layout. ATX is going to offer the most connectivity when it comes to what you can actually install in the system, with additional PCIe slots and also additional fan headers, and also you will have more DIMM slots available to you on an ATX motherboard compared to an ITX motherboard or some micro ATX motherboards. Now, you can scale down from ATX down to what's called micro ATX, which is a slightly smaller version of ATX but with a couple of less PCIe slots. Depending on which micro ATX board you choose, they can often come with 4 DIMM slots, which gives you room for expansion in the future for your memory, and they also have ones which come with only 2 DIMM slots, which can limit your room for expansion in the future if you did wish to add more memory. But scaling down even further, the smallest one you can go for is a mini ITX motherboard. Now, you will find sometimes ITX boards can actually be a bit more expensive than a micro ATX board and an ATX board, even though there are less features. But the thing that you have to consider when it comes to ITX is that due to the smaller footprint, they have got to squeeze the standard features you would have on a regular size motherboard into a smaller form factor. But going ITX, there are still some sacrifices that you will encounter, such as only having 1 PCIe Express slot, less fan headers, and also only 2 DIMM slots. So once you decide on what size you're going to go for, one of the things you're going to have to pay close attention to is the I/O and connectivity on the motherboard itself. Now, when I refer to I/O and connectivity, I refer to both things externally that you will have on your actual motherboard's I/O on the rear of the motherboard, and also the actual connectivity options you have on the motherboard internally itself. So on the rear of your motherboard, you'll have lots of USB options to choose from. You can also either get 1 gigabit or 2.5 gigabit LAN ports. You can get USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C ports. You can get wireless AC on some motherboards as well. And you also get a choice of audio line in and line outs. Now, some power users might want to have as many USB ports as possible, which is a feature which is on more higher end motherboards, so it's worth taking a look to see what options you do have when it comes to connectivity. When looking on the motherboard itself, some of the things you should consider so you can connect everything you need to the motherboard itself As an example, only some motherboards come with a USB 3.2 Gen 2 header on the motherboard, which will allow you to plug in a cable coming from your case with a USB Type-C port directly onto the motherboard. This is included on this Asus motherboard, so it's quite a handy feature to have if you have a case that supports it. Additional headers that you could consider are the amount of fan headers on your motherboard. If you're planning on running with an absolute ton of fans, then you will need to be able to connect them to your motherboard, or alternatively, you can get a fan controller instead. Now with this ITX board, there are actually 3 fan headers, so that's usually a bit more than you would normally get on certain ITX boards. But even then, you are limited in what you can actually connect. But you can also make use of fan splitters, but make sure to check how much power your fan header can actually supply to your fans. There are a multitude of different connectivity options on a motherboard, so you will have to go through and decide which ones are more suited to your needs depending on what motherboard you go for. In addition to connectivity, you'll also have to consider what storage you're going to be using with your system. There are many different form factors for storage, and some of the things you will have to decide on is whether you'll be using an M.2 SSD or a 2.5-inch SSD or a 3.5-inch mechanical drive. Now, for a SATA-based drive, you will need to connect that using a SATA data cable, which will be connected on these SATA headers on the motherboard. This motherboard has 4 of them. If you have to connect even more, then you would have to make sure you had a motherboard that could support it. Alternatively, you can go for an M.2 form factor, which again can support SATA speeds on an M.2 slot, or alternatively, you can go for faster NVMe drive. Now, depending on what NVMe drive you'd be considering, you would have to consider whether your motherboard will support the speeds that that SSD can provide. You can go for an NVMe Gen 3 drive, which will be supported across most motherboards, or alternatively, you can go for a Gen 4 SSD. Gen 4 is going to have the best read and write speeds for your system, but you will have to have a motherboard that supports it. This B550 board supports Gen 4 on the front M.2 slot. There is also an additional M.2 slot on the rear of the motherboard, but that will only support Gen 3. If you were to go for a more premium chipset such as X570, then that would support multiple Gen 4 drives. So again, something to consider when you're looking at what storage options you have. Now, one of the other things you're going to have to consider when it comes to connectivity is what PCIe Express components you are going to install in your system. Typically, for basically any gaming PC, you are going to have a graphics card, which would go in the top slot on your motherboard. In this example with an ITX board, it only has the 1 slot, so we are limited in that situation. But with ATX and micro ATX motherboards, you do have a few more options when it comes to what you can install. Now, one of the other really big things that is worth considering when choosing a motherboard is one of the more challenging aspects to look at when it comes to a motherboard, which is its VRM build quality. Now, if you're not in the know of what a VRM is, it's a voltage regulation module. The purpose of this is to take the 12 volt power supplied by your power supply and convert that down to around 1 to 1.5 volts to supply to your CPU. A VRM is made up of 3 parts: MOSFETs, inductors, or perhaps chokes, and then capacitors. The whole purpose of a VRM, like I said, is to reduce that power to a more suitable voltage for your CPU. But you do want to have a VRM that can supply clean and efficient power to your processor. Now, it's important to have a good VRM, but unless you're going to be doing any intense overclocking, it is an aspect of a motherboard which you don't have to look into too much. I would still advise you to understand the overall design of your motherboard when choosing what you want to go for. If you can get a motherboard with a really good VRM, that will help you if you are considering overclocking. For this B550i board, it's obviously going to be slightly more limited in its VRM design compared to an ATX motherboard, but it has an A+2 250 amp power stage, suitable for higher end CPUs with a higher core count, but it won't overclock as well as other motherboards which have an even beefier VRM design. Now, I can't do a motherboard video without mentioning the fact that you should consider whether you are looking to bling out your system with RGB. Me personally, I'm not particularly concerned with whether my motherboard includes RGB or not. A lot of them will have RGB featured on the motherboard, and you can control that either through the motherboard's BIOS or through their chosen software package for that RGB. If you're really into your RGB lighting and RGB devices, then make sure you consider that when looking at your motherboard. Now, the final thing, and one of the most important things to consider when choosing a motherboard, is the price. Now, if you're trying to build a more entry-level budget system, then you can get away with using slightly cheaper and more budget-friendly options such as B450 or B460, any of those ones that are more catered to a basic gaming system. Additionally, when you're in that price bracket of trying to keep everything under budget, you can save on your motherboard and put that money towards more important components such as your CPU or graphics card. But if you are looking for the best performance possible with a multitude of features which you would like to have included on your system, then you can feel free to go for the more higher end options, but you will have to pay a premium to get up there. So there's quite a lot to talk about when it comes to motherboards, but things that I've discussed in this video today, they are the general things I like to consider when looking for one myself. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, then please feel free to like and subscribe for more videos on the way soon. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.